Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. I'm very humbled. I've been out of this country since 1976, so I feel a little awkward in some ways about giving you my vision, not having had the opportunity to be with you for the last 35 years or more than that to see how the country has gone. But I will try to do what I can. And please bear with me if it seems, you know, too far away from what the reality is on the ground here. So our conference themes are these 8 topics here. And unfortunately, maybe you can't see the few that I've added. It's pretty key that all of these ideas are very much interconnected. And the 3 that I've added are strength and diversity, combating disinformation, and global engagement. All of these are, as I said, interconnected, and the one that I'm going to talk about in particular is energy. That's the area of my research. So you saw a plot similar to this from Minister Seleshi. It was GDP, I believe, or GDP per capita, if I remember, versus electricity. This is the Human Development Index versus energy use per capita. So all types of energy, not just electricity, and some sort of, so this is a very much a quantitative number. You can debate the data, but it's simply a number. There's nothing, a social or political implication to it. Human Development Index is a number that's put together by the UN to try to account for things like life expectancy, access to education, and some other factors, access to healthcare, and has more recently included gender equity. But the key is that you can see that in general, as energy use increases, Human Development Index also increases. But the correlation is not one-to-one. There are a few countries which use a whole lot of energy but don't have particularly high Human Development Index. So a few examples in here. On the other hand, there are a few that are extremely high in this development index but don't use a whole lot of energy. So Hong Kong is a nice example here. And Ethiopia, of course, is here in terms of its energy use per capita. It is quite small, and its development index is also quite small. I've put a dot here for a country that I'm sure no one would guess what it is. And I should also say that these move around year by year. So when you see the data, there'll be one country that's anomalous, you know, one year and sort of below or in the clump the next year. So I'll give you a minute to think about what that might be. I'll tell you the star here is the world average. So probably everyone's done thinking about what this could be. This turns out to be Sri Lanka, of all countries. I would not have guessed. If we extrapolate what's happening with Ethiopia, and we just look at, you know, I just fit a parabolic plot to energy use per capita for Ethiopia, we'd be very small increase here, and that would correspond to a very small increase in the Human Development Index from about 0.46 to 0.61. You know, the best here is Norway at approaching 1. It's about 0.95. So if we just follow the current trends, that doesn't look very promising for us. And there are, again, other countries that do very well. So Bangladesh, in particular, has a quite high Human Development Index without using a whole lot of energy. Okay, so world energy consumption is going up because, of course, we all want to have a great quality of life. And if we view that energy consumption is important for our quality of life, here it is going up: oil, gas, nuclear power, hydroelectric, renewables, this very small sliver in here, and then coal. Okay, so it's all going up, and you already heard what this means in terms of global climate change. So this is temperature for 1,500 years, pretty close to this flat value. This is where we are now, and these are the various projected scenarios with the International Panel on Climate Change, or Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change. So this is some pretty serious stuff. But you might argue Well, I mean, it's really not our fault. If we look at our fault being here in Ethiopia, if we look at per capita emissions of CO2, there are some outliers here. Qatar, which was the one that uses the highest energy of any country, is up here. US is, well above the world average. Japan, Germany, even China has now come up quite a bit. The numbers here are from a few years back, from 2014. And then I couldn't even remember, where, all the African countries are in here. I think Ethiopia is somewhere down here. So you could make the argument it's not our fault and it won't affect us much. And we saw a little bit of how that might affect us. But we can certainly say, we didn't contribute to this. But the challenge is really that we are vulnerable here. And this is a summary of world risk from climate change. So even though there is going to be a lot of temperature increase in the northern hemisphere, the places where the risk is greatest is around the equator, where of course the development is also lowest. And in the case of Ethiopia, that risk is high because of what you heard of, the fact that there is going to be a big variability in the rainfall. So the climate predictions for Addis Ababa by 2050 is that the average temperature will have gone up by a little less than 2 degrees Celsius. So that is less than the global average, which again is going to be more severe in the north. That the high temperature will, still be very pleasant. This is a great place to come when you live in Chicago and to come here for around late December. So that, you could argue maybe that's not so bad in terms of the increase in temperatures, but the rainfall is what's going to change. So the annual rainfall will increase by about 20%, and the wettest month is going to be substantially wetter than it is today. So again, this is what makes Ethiopia very vulnerable to climate change. And this is the change in precipitation that's been predicted overall, and areas will become much drier, and some areas will become much wetter. Again, that makes it very difficult to maintain and to plan well. But I would say that we should take pride in the fact that Ethiopia was the first developing country to submit its what's called the nationally determined contribution to the UN plan under the Paris Climate Accord to decrease its or meet various emissions goals. On the other hand, just sort of this one hand doesn't talk to the other, Ethiopia is, building a natural gas pipeline that extends from the Ogaden to Djibouti, which of course is financed by China. So this sort of dichotomy of approaches that, yes, we'd like to have that income from exporting the natural gas, yet on the other hand, we recognize that the world shouldn't be using that natural gas because look what it does for us. So what is the role of energy in human society? So this is a summary from Lambert that suggests, and I hope the colors are not so dark that you can hopefully read it, but if you have just enough energy to extract it, then that's all you do. If you have a little more energy, you can start to refine it. If you keep going on, you can use it for transportation, to grow food, to support your family, to now have education, to invest in healthcare. And then at the very, very top, you might, if you have a lot of energy relative to the energy return compared to how much it costs you to get it out, is 10 to 1, then maybe you can have time for things like the arts, for what in some scenarios is considered a frivolous pastime. So development generally means a focus on these things, and the sustainable development goals and so on, eliminating poverty, important things. And so what that means is that education is often viewed as being something that's in support of how do we grow food better? How do we deliver transportation in a better way? So these are certainly important goals, but hopefully they're not the only thing that we use education for. So how does the world actually use energy? And I hope I'm not, I can't possibly be as provocative as my uncle, but hopefully this is not terribly provocative. But we use energy in a way that, in fact, is not very good for our health. We tend to use, cause a large fraction of the population to be to have health problems simply from consumption. And this is a plot put together, and the share of adults who are overweight. And you can see there is a trend, but there's a scatter. And what's interesting here is that countries like South Korea, Japan, Singapore, China have managed to direct their energy towards other parts of their society as opposed to using it towards consumption for the human consumption. So it's a challenge, because if you use your energy resource in a way that is unhealthy, then of course your health bill goes up as well. And that's really a problem in the US, for example. So if we extrapolated Ethiopia to 2050, again, I just fit parabolic curves, our second polynomial curves to this. I told you our number would be, energy use per capita would be 540 kilograms of oil equivalent. And we're the lowest here in terms of the fraction of the population that's overweight, but we would be, just following the trends that we are doing today, we'd be about a third of the population overweight. Of course, we have a huge problem with malnourishment. About 50% of the country is malnourished, so we have to figure out how we balance that, where we have food resources and who needs it. So where do we actually use all of our energy in Ethiopia? Well, biomass is considered about 92% of the use, and that's in cooking, and it hasn't come up yet, but of course this is, causes all sorts of deforestation, and we heard the great news about how many trees Ethiopia has managed to plant in the last year. Very impressive results. We use the oil imports in lovely traffic jams in Addis Ababa. I'm sure many of you felt that this morning as you were coming here. And then our hydro, solar, and wind are all in the electricity sector. So in Ethiopia, hydro accounts for over 90% of the electricity. So this is where we use it in Ethiopia today. And let me say, so the total energy use in 2017, again, these numbers are a little bit hard to get a hold of, was 95 megawatt hours. I'm going to give you something that helps you put that in context. So it turns out to be 11 gigawatts. Okay? So a large power plant would be about 500 megawatts. So that would, that's a very, very small fraction of this. So maybe a large power plant maybe would be 1 gigawatt. So a nuclear power plant would be on the order of 1 gigawatt. So that's how much Ethiopia is using, would be about 20 power plants in the US, 22. Okay, so it's hard for me to get data, and I mentioned a little bit about, beware of disinformation and honest mistakes. So this is data that's actually recorded at the World Bank website. And if you look at rural access to electricity, it's at this level that's here, 20%, sort of rising up to maybe the high 20s. But conveniently in 2007, it reached 82%. Now, either this was an error in whoever was doing the data entry, or it was an attempt to show this dramatic exponential increase over 3 years, right? So you can think about which one it was, and you have to, of course, then, strengthen education so that you can recognize that there's something wrong with this data point. And you also have to avoid confirmation bias, because if you didn't like the government at the time, you might say, oh, this is a government ploy to intentionally put out disinformation. On the other hand, you could say, well, it was just an honest mistake. I don't know which one it was. Okay, so I want to say just a little bit about our petroleum imports. Again, hard to get the actual numbers, but it's on the order of 4 to 5% of Ethiopian imports is in the area of petroleum. So again, I know that many of you drove this morning, so let's look at how much we spent on gasoline. So I'm just going to estimate as best I can that it's expenditure of 400 million USD. Okay, so if I take the worldwide average price of gasoline, that is 2.5 million liters of gasoline per day. Okay, so how much gasoline does Addis Ababa consume? Well, our population, the numbers also that I can find, anywhere between 5 and 10 million. Let me say 6 million. Okay, so I'm going to guess, based on my limited experience here, but anyone can give me their input, that about 20% of the population here spends about 2 hours in a car per day. So either with a driver or driving themselves. So that's maybe a reasonable guess. And so the total time in the vehicles, if I just take 20% of that population, 2 hours a day, is 2.5 million hours. Okay? All right, great. Most of that time is spent idling. Again, from my experience, I'd say about 80%. And it's certainly not spent going quickly. So idling or slow driving consumes about 1 liter of gasoline per hour. All right, so that's pretty easy now. We're just going to do a multiplication to figure out how much that is. 2.4 million liters per day. Well, that's almost exactly how much it seems we're importing. So we're spending all of those oil imports basically idling in Addis Ababa traffic. That's kind of crazy to me. It's also crazy to me that the distances traveled in the city are quite small compared to the distances traveled on the countryside, yet they're not the ones using the cars. Huh, interesting. Okay, so as I said, we spent most of our imports on idling. So here's what I would say is a vision for 2050, is that taking that energy triangle, turning it into sort of an hourglass. Say, again, I'm sorry the bright doesn't come out very well, but this is our expenditure, energy expenditure on extracting and refining the energy so that we can use it. And then in the middle is food, clothing, shelter, healthcare. That we don't, those are the those that we need to do. But where we can expend a lot of energy, I would hope, is in the areas of education, arts, and sports. Those things that make us really human, things that make us beyond foraging and trying to just stay alive and just be moderately comfortable. So in my view, energy is the only real currency. All other forms of currency, dollars, birr, even gold, those are human constructs. We can, even in the world of gold and beauty, we can replace gold with some other metal that might be more beautiful. We might think diamond is very precious, but I can give you cubic zirconia, which looks almost identical. So I think even mineral resources are not as fundamental as the energy resource. And ultimately, if we have enough energy, I think we can free ourselves from things that we consider drudgery, that we can focus our attention up on this area. So again, we heard about the energy resources that Ethiopia has, a little over 5 kilowatt hours of solar insolation per meter squared per day, and the wind potential. These numbers, I don't even know how to guess because I see numbers between 4 and 100 gigawatts. I told you that Ethiopia currently is using a capacity on the order of 11 gigawatts. If I just take the average energy use and divide it by the number of seconds in a day, that's what we have. So we could do it all by wind. And even if I take this